Before electric light existed, humans spent roughly half of every day in conditions darker than any modern bedroom, with the curtains drawn. Not dim, not shadowy, completely disorienting dark. On overcast nights, you genuinely could not see your own hand in front of your face, and for 300,000 years, this was not a problem to be solved. It was simply life. What early humans did during those hours has turned out to reveal something deeply surprising about sleep, language, consciousness, and human culture itself. The question of how ancient humans spent their nights is not just historically interesting, it cuts to the center of several ongoing scientific debates about why modern humans are so chronically sleep deprived, why storytelling is universal across every known culture, and whether a forgotten phase of human consciousness has been quietly erased by artificial light. The answers are stranger than most people would guess. Start with fire, because fire is where the story of the human night actually begins. The earliest solid evidence of our ancestors controlling fire comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, and it dates back roughly 1 million years. Evidence of charred bone and plant ash at the site indicates repeated, intentional burning rather than accidental exposure to wildfires. But the full restructuring of the human day by fire came much later and much more gradually than a single discovery site can tell us. Before fire was reliably controlled, humans behaved very much like other large primates when the sun went down. You found a safe position, a tree, a rock overhang, a dense thicket, and you stayed there. You did not move. Moving at night meant becoming prey. Human eyes are spectacularly poorly adapted to low light conditions compared to most of the predators that shared our ancestral environments. The tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that gives cats and leopards their glowing eyes in the dark, is absent in humans entirely. A leopard operating in near total darkness loses very little of its effectiveness. A human loses almost everything. Fire solved this in an immediate and dramatic way. Anthropological observations of modern hunter-gatherer groups who still live in environments with significant predator populations have documented a clear pattern. The area within roughly 9 to 10 meters of an active fire represents a genuine safety perimeter. Large predators, lions, leopards, hyenas consistently avoid it. Humans who stray beyond that zone at night face sharply elevated risk. The campfire was not just warm and pleasant, it was the difference between surviving the night and not. But here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint. Fire did not just protect humans at night, it gave them something that no other animal on Earth had ever had in quite the same way: discretionary time after dark. Before fire, the usable day ended at sunset. Depending on the season and latitude, that could mean as few as 8 hours of productive time in winter months. Fire pushed that boundary outward by 2 to 4 hours every single night. Over hundreds of generations, those hours accumulated into something enormous. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years conducting detailed observations and recordings among the Jew Hoanzi Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, a group whose way of life offers one of the closest available windows into how humans lived for most of our species' history. She published her analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014, and the findings revealed a pattern so consistent it is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. During daylight hours, conversations among the Jew Hoanzi were overwhelmingly practical. Roughly 80% of daytime talk involved logistics, resources, coordination, and economic decision-making. Who is hunting where? Which water sources are still reliable? How to resolve a conflict over a shared resource. Daytime conversation was work. At night, around the fire, the entire character of conversation shifted. Approximately 81% of nighttime conversation was storytelling. Not just any storytelling, specifically the kind of narratives that carry social information about distant people, places, and times. Stories about someone's encounter with a stranger 3 days walk away, tales about how the world was made, accounts of remarkable hunts, difficult journeys, unusual animals, surprising people, myths that explained why the sky looks the way it does or why certain plants are poisonous, jokes that convened the whole camp into shared laughter. Wiesner argued that this firelit storytelling was not mere entertainment. It served a function that would have been genuinely difficult to replicate in any other context. Storytelling around the fire transmits information across time and space. It lets individuals who have never met someone else benefit from that person's experience. It creates shared frameworks of understanding shared values, shared history, shared cosmology that bind groups larger than any individual's direct social circle. It allows humans to plan for events that have not happened yet, to model the minds of people they will never encounter, to coordinate behavior based on abstract principles rather than just immediate sensory experience. In short, Wiesner's data suggests that the campfire was the original infrastructure of human culture, not a metaphor for culture, literally the physical setting where the cognitive capacities that define human culture, theory of mind, long-range social coordination, narrative reasoning, symbolic thinking were exercised, refined, and transmitted across generations. If that interpretation is correct, then the human night was not just a period to be survived, it was a developmental environment for the species. This changes how we should think about the emergence of distinctly human cognition. The archaeological record shows a dramatic acceleration in the complexity and symbolic richness of human artifacts beginning roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. Cave paintings, decorated objects, evidence of long-distance trade in shells and ochre, musical instruments. This is sometimes called the human revolution, and its causes have been debated intensely for decades. Fire-extended nights and the storytelling culture they enabled represent at least one serious candidate for part of the explanation. Now, set the storytelling aside for a moment, because something else was happening in those dark hours, something that only resurfaced in the scientific literature in the 1990s, and that overturns one of the most basic assumptions most people carry about their own biology. You almost certainly believe that sleeping in one continuous block of 7 to 9 hours is the normal, natural, healthy human sleep pattern. You may have heard this so many times from so many sources that it feels like a biological given. It is not. The evidence that it is not comes from two independent directions: history and controlled laboratory experiments. Both tell exactly the same story. Historian Roger Kirch spent 16 years combing through historical records from across pre-industrial Europe and beyond. He published his findings in 2001, and the paper upended the field of sleep science. Kirch had found more than 500 references spread across centuries and across entirely different types of documents: prayer books from the 1400s, court records, medical texts, personal diaries, letters from ordinary people, literary works including passages in Homer's Odyssey, all of them describing the same distinctive sleep pattern. The pattern had a name. People called it first sleep and second sleep. Individuals would go to bed shortly after dark, perhaps an hour or two after sunset, and sleep for roughly 4 hours. Then they would wake up. They would remain awake for somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. Then they would go back to sleep for another 4 hours until dawn. This was not insomnia. The historical sources make this unambiguously clear. The middle of the night wakeful period was expected, normal, and purposeful. People did things during it. A French physician in the 16th century recommended the quiet hours between first and second sleep as the optimal time for couples to conceive children, on the grounds that they were more rested and attentive than they would be at any other time. People visited neighbors. They interpreted their dreams, while those dreams were still vivid and fresh in memory. They prayed. They read when they had access to books. Medical manuals from the 1500s explicitly advised patients to use the watch, as it was called, for study and reflection, describing it as a period when the mind was unusually calm and receptive. Kirch noted something extraordinary about how historians had handled these references before he systematically catalogued them. Because modern people sleep in one continuous block and have done so for several generations, the assumption that this is simply how humans sleep was so deep and unexamined that scholars had literally mistranslated ancient Greek and medieval Latin texts to make first sleep mean something else. The cognitive bias was strong enough to bend translation. Then, in 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Wehr at the National Institute of Mental Health ran a controlled experiment that validated everything the historical record had been saying. Wehr recruited volunteers and removed all artificial light from their daily lives for a period of 1 month. Each evening, participants experienced 14 hours of darkness, an approximation of the conditions early humans would have faced before fire extended the usable evening. Within a few weeks, without any instruction or suggestion from the researchers, every participant settled into the same sleep architecture. 4 hours of sleep, 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, 4 more hours of sleep. The behavior emerged spontaneously, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface the entire time, suppressed by a century and a half of electric light. Ver's team measured hormone levels during the wakeful period and found something that nobody had anticipated. The participants were not simply awake in the ordinary sense. Their brains were producing elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone most commonly associated with nursing in mammals, but also consistently elevated during meditation and following orgasm in both sexes. Prolactin during the watch period was significantly higher than at any other point in the 24-hour cycle. The subjective reports from participants matched the biochemistry. They described a wakeful window between first and second sleep as peaceful, reflective, and slightly dissociative, in a pleasant way closer to a meditative state than to ordinary waking consciousness. Several described it as unlike anything they normally experienced. This was not simply a gap in sleep, it was a distinct mode of consciousness with measurable neurochemical markers, a mode that, Ver's data suggested, modern humans systematically eliminate by filling their evenings with artificial light. Think about the implications of this. If the segmented sleep pattern is the biological default, then what most people experience as insomnia, waking in the middle of the night, lying awake for an hour, unable to return to sleep, is not a malfunction. It is the normal human sleep architecture trying to reassert itself against 2 centuries of artificial suppression. You are not broken. You are running ancient software on hardware that was never updated. Sleep researchers now distinguish between what they call consolidated sleep, the single block that modern life demands, and biphasic sleep, which describes the segmented pattern. The transition from biphasic to consolidated sleep happened remarkably recently in historical terms. Street lighting began to appear in European cities in the 1600s. Paris installed lanterns under Louis XIV, partly as a crime reduction measure. London followed. In the 1800s, gas lamps made artificial illumination far cheaper and more widespread. Then in 1879, Thomas Edison commercialized the incandescent electric bulb, and the pace of change accelerated past any individual's ability to notice it. Within a single generation after widespread electrification, references to first and second sleep disappeared from personal diaries and medical literature. The pattern did not gradually fade, it vanished. The night that humans had navigated by firelight for hundreds of thousands of years was replaced almost overnight by something entirely new, a world where darkness was optional. Here is a fact that captures the scale of this change. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, which means to cover the fire. In medieval towns, a bell would ring each evening signaling that residents should extinguish or cover their fires. The curfew was not primarily about controlling people's movements, it was a fire safety and community management practice. But the fact that such a signal was necessary tells you something important about how the night was understood. Night was darkness. Night was sleep. Night was not a time to be abroad without urgent reason. In many medieval European towns, walking outside after dark without a lantern was legally prohibited. Night belonged to criminals and to the supernatural forces that people genuinely believed populated the darkness. The fear of night that modern people can barely imagine was not irrational given the context. In a world without reliable artificial light, darkness was dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from a contemporary perspective. Predators, certainly, but also the social danger of encountering people whose intentions you could not read. The conquest of night by artificial light was experienced at the time as straightforward progress, and in many ways it was. Crime rates associated with nighttime fell, productivity extended. The quality of life for people doing skilled work improved dramatically when they were no longer dependent on expensive candles. Nobody at the time was mourning the loss of something they had not realized they possessed. But the biological costs of that conquest have become steadily clearer over the past 50 years. Modern humans are exposed to artificial light, on average, for 7 to 8 hours after sunset. This light, particularly the short wavelength blue light emitted by LED screens and energy-efficient lighting, suppresses melatonin production in a way that is neurologically indistinguishable from actual daylight. The photoreceptors in the human retina that communicate with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's central circadian clock, cannot tell the difference between sunlight and a smartphone screen. Both register as, "It is daytime, do not sleep." When you look at a screen at 11 at night, your brain interprets this as morning. Melatonin release is delayed. The cascade of hormonal and neural changes that prepare you for sleep is postponed by hours. Your circadian rhythm, which evolved over millions of years to synchronize with the solar day, is pushed out of phase with the actual position of the sun. The consequences are not subtle. Chronic circadian disruption is associated with elevated risk of metabolic disorders including type 2 diabetes, immune dysfunction, impaired memory consolidation, increased cancer risk, particularly cancers of the breast, prostate, and colon, and a broad range of mental health outcomes. Night shift workers who experience the most severe form of circadian disruption show these effects most dramatically, but the general population is not far behind them. Most people in industrialized countries are running on a mild but continuous sleep deficit while simultaneously suppressing the biological signals that would normally regulate that deficit. One of the most striking demonstrations of how quickly this can reverse comes from a study of campers conducted by sleep researcher Kenneth Wright at the University of Colorado. Participants who spent just 1 week camping without access to any artificial light showed melatonin cycles that had shifted nearly 2 hours earlier by the end of the week. Their bodies began producing sleep-onset melatonin at sunset rather than hours after it. 1 week of darkness was enough for the circadian system to largely reset itself to its natural calibration. This finding suggests something important. The gap between how our bodies are designed to operate and how modern life actually requires us to operate is not a fixed biological limitation. It is an ongoing environmental mismatch. The biology is intact. The hardware has not changed. What has changed is the context that hardware was designed to run in. The deeper you go into the research on ancient human nighttime behavior, the more the night emerges as something that was actively lived rather than simply endured. Beyond the fire circles and the storytelling, hunter-gatherer groups observed by anthropologists in recent centuries showed sophisticated awareness of the night sky that is essentially lost to most modern people. In cities and suburbs where the majority of the global population now lives, light pollution has rendered the Milky Way invisible to roughly 80% of North Americans and 60% of Europeans. The galaxy that arched overhead every clear night for the entirety of human prehistory is now something most people have to travel to see. For ancient humans, the night sky was not a spectacle. It was a practical navigation tool, a seasonal calendar, and a source of constant raw material for the symbolic thought that storytelling requires. The positions of stars relative to the horizon indicated season and time. The phases of the moon structured monthly social and practical rhythms. Meteor showers, planetary conjunctions, the occasional comet, these were vivid, shared experiences that generated stories, and stories generated meaning. The night also shaped how humans related to one another within their groups. Anthropological research on hunter-gatherer sleep patterns conducted by Jerome Siegel and colleagues at UCLA and published in 2015 found that hunter-gatherer groups in 3 different parts of the patterns world: the Jew Hoansi in Namibia, the Hadza in Tanzania, and the Tsimane in Bolivia did not all sleep simultaneously. Group members fell asleep and woke at different times in a staggered pattern. At virtually no point during the night was every member of the group asleep at once. The researchers proposed that this may have served a natural sentinel function. With group members cycling through sleep and wakefulness at different times, there was almost always someone at least lightly awake and capable of responding to threat. Not a deliberate watch schedule, just the natural variation in individual sleep timing producing a statistical form of collective vigilance. This pattern is another thing that modern life has disrupted. Electric light and the social expectation that the night is for sleep have pushed most household members towards synchronized sleep schedules. The natural variation that may have served a protective function for hundreds of thousands of years has been engineered away, quietly and without anyone deciding it was worth thinking about. Researchers studying the cognitive effects of the segmented sleep pattern, particularly the meditative wakeful period between first and second sleep, have raised a question that is difficult to answer with current evidence, worth taking seriously. Complex emotional processing, creative insight, and the consolidation of autobiographical memory all show activity during REM sleep. But several studies also suggest that quiet wakefulness, especially early morning wakefulness, plays a role in integrating the content of dreams into conscious self-understanding. Anthropologically, the practice of immediately discussing and interpreting dreams while they are still fresh, something documented consistently in hunter-gatherer cultures around the world, may serve a function in processing emotionally significant experiences. Sleep researchers now understand that REM sleep is heavily involved in emotional memory consolidation. The nightly storytelling that Wiesner documented was not just about transmitting cultural information outward, it may also have supported psychological integration inward. The elimination of the wakeful watch period, from this perspective, is not just the loss of a quiet hour in the dark, it is the loss of a cognitive space, a regular interval of low arousal, high prolactin wakefulness that may have served functions we do not yet fully understand. The fact that people consistently report this state when they experience it as unusual and valuable is at minimum suggestive. What sleep science does not yet know is how much of the benefit of segmented sleep comes from the biphasic architecture itself versus the specific neurochemical environment of the wakeful interval versus simply the total sleep duration. Controlled experiments that isolate these variables without disrupting the natural emergence of the pattern are methodologically very difficult to design. Ware's original study was suggestive but small. Replication at scale remains largely undone. What researchers do know with confidence is that the circadian system is far more dynamic and responsive to environmental light conditions than was understood as recently as 30 years ago. The discovery of intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, a third type of photoreceptor in the human eye, distinct from rods and cones, specifically dedicated to communicating ambient light levels to the circadian clock, transformed the field. These cells were not even known to exist until 2002. They are maximally sensitive to blue wavelengths, which is why screen light is particularly disruptive and why blue light filtering has become a research area of serious interest. Ongoing studies are examining whether light exposure protocols, specific patterns of bright morning light and reduced evening light can restore more natural melatonin timing in urban populations without requiring people to abandon electric light entirely. The results are promising but preliminary. Behavioral interventions, including simply dimming lights and avoiding screens in the hour or two before sleep, produce measurable improvements in melatonin timing in controlled conditions. Whether people actually do this in real-world settings is a different question. There is also growing research interest in the long-term developmental effects of childhood light exposure on circadian system calibration. Children's circadian rhythms are more plastic than adults, and there is some evidence that high levels of artificial light exposure during development may shift the baseline circadian timing in ways that persist into adulthood. This is relevant to the epidemic of delayed sleep phase disorder among adolescents, a condition in which sleep onset is consistently delayed by hours relative to socially expected bedtimes, producing chronic sleep deficit during the school week. The night, in other words, is not just a historical or anthropological curiosity. It is an active research frontier with direct relevance to population-level health outcomes that cost economies enormous amounts of money and cause genuine suffering to large numbers of people. 300,000 years of nights spent in near-total darkness, gathered around fires, telling stories, sleeping in two phases with a quiet meditative interval between them, watching a sky bright enough to navigate by all of that shaped the biology and the cognitive architecture you are currently using to read these words. The switch happened so fast, in evolutionary terms, that the biology has not caught up. The hardware expects a world that no longer exists. Whether that matters, and how much it matters, and what, if anything, can be done about it at scale, are questions that researchers are actively working to answer. The answers will require combining historical scholarship, anthropological observation, chronobiology, neuroscience, and public health in ways that are still being developed. What is already clear is that the human relationship with night and darkness is far more complex, far more biologically significant, and far more recently altered than most people have any reason to suspect. The night that your ancestors lived through was not an obstacle, it was an environment, one that shaped how they slept, how they thought, how they talked to each other, and what they imagined. When you lie awake at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling before you reach for your phone and flood your retinas with blue light, consider for a moment that this might not be your body failing. It might be your body remembering. If you found this exploration useful, consider sharing it with someone who might benefit from thinking about sleep differently, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. To understand why this matters so deeply, it helps to zoom out to a much longer timescale and think about what the emergence of controlled fire actually represented in the trajectory of human evolution. The control of fire is not just one tool among many. Paleoanthropologists and evolutionary biologists have increasingly argued that fire use fundamentally reshaped human anatomy, metabolism, and brain development in ways that are still with us. Richard Wrangham at Harvard University has been the most prominent advocate for the hypothesis that cooking with fire, a development that appears to have become widespread in Homo erectus roughly 1.8 million years ago, well before anatomically modern humans emerged, was the single most important technological transition in human evolution. Cooked food is dramatically more bioavailable than raw food. The process of cooking breaks down cell walls, denatures proteins, and gelatinizes starches in ways that make the caloric content of food far more accessible to human digestion. The implications of this are profound. A raw food diet requires an enormous amount of gut length to extract sufficient calories. Humans have unusually short digestive tracts compared to other great apes of similar body size. This shortening of the gut, Wrangham argues, was made possible by cooking by the shift to a diet that required less digestive processing because so much of the processing had already been done by heat. The caloric surplus that resulted from more efficient food processing was redirected to the most energetically expensive organ in the body, the brain. The human brain is remarkable in its energy demands. It accounts for roughly 2% of body mass, but consumes approximately 20% of the body's caloric budget at rest. No other primate comes close to this ratio. Sustaining a brain of this size requires either an extremely efficient digestive system, an extremely high-calorie diet, or both. Cooking fire provided the efficiency. The dietary shift to include more animal protein around the same time provided the calories. If this hypothesis is correct, and the debate continues, though Wrangham's position has gained significant support, then fire did not just extend the night, it built the brain that would fill that extended night with culture. The campfire was both the forge that shaped human cognition and the environment in which that cognition was first exercised. That is a remarkable loop to contemplate. Now consider what fire meant in terms of thermoregulation. Humans are one of the very few mammals that are essentially hairless. This is a significant liability in cold environments without supplemental heat sources. But hair loss, evolutionary biologists have argued, was itself an adaptation to the demands of endurance running in hot savanna environments, where the ability to shed heat through sweating gave our ancestors a dramatic edge over prey animals that could only pant. Hairlessness made humans faster and more persistent hunters during the day. Fire made hairless humans survivable at night in temperate and cold environments. The two adaptations were therefore complementary in a way that suggests they may have co-evolved. This means the human body, as it currently exists, was shaped in part by the expectation of fire. The assumption of an external heat source at night is built into the architecture of the organism. When you sleep without adequate warmth and your body temperature drops below a certain threshold, your sleep architecture fragments. This is why cold sleeping environments reliably worsen sleep quality. It is also, possibly, one reason why sleeping in close proximity to other people, which raises the ambient temperature of the sleeping space, has been the universal human norm for nearly all of our history. The nuclear family sleeping in separate rooms in a climate-controlled house is extremely recent. Anthropological surveys of sleep practices across cultures have consistently found that solitary sleep is unusual. Most humans throughout history slept in groups, family groups, kinship groups, or community sleeping arrangements that were more communal than private. This is not merely about warmth, though warmth is part of it. It is also about security. A sleeping individual is maximally vulnerable. Sleeping in a group distributes that vulnerability and provides a degree of mutual monitoring. The group sleep architecture identified by Siegel and colleagues, with members cycling through different sleep stages and maintaining statistical vigilance across the night, would function much better in a communal sleeping space than in isolated bedrooms. The privatization of sleep, like the consolidation of sleep into a single block, is another very recent development. The historical record from pre-industrial Europe describes sleeping arrangements that would strike most modern Westerners as remarkably crowded. Large households commonly shared sleeping rooms, and sharing a bed with family members, guests, or even strangers at inns was entirely normal. Privacy in sleep was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even among the wealthy it was considerably less universal than modern people assume. The shift toward private sleeping arrangements followed from the combination of rising prosperity, changing ideas about hygiene and privacy, and architectural changes that made individual bedrooms economical. It accelerated through the 19th and 20th centuries and is now so thoroughly established as the default in industrialized societies that it seems like a natural state rather than a recent cultural construction. What is genuinely remarkable is how many fundamental aspects of human sleep, the timing, the structure, the social context, the light environment, have been altered simultaneously and in the same direction, all within an evolutionary eye blink. The pace of change has been far faster than any adaptation through natural selection could track. Let us go deeper into the neuroscience of what darkness and the night sky actually do to the human brain, because the effects are more extensive than most people realize and involve brain systems that are not obviously connected to sleep. The circadian system is regulated primarily through the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a tiny paired structure in the hypothalamus containing roughly 20,000 neurons. It functions as a master clock, coordinating the timing of virtually every physiological process in the body: hormone release, immune function, cellular repair, metabolic rate, body temperature, alertness, and cognitive performance, according to a roughly 24-hour cycle. The word circadian comes from the Latin circa dies, meaning approximately a day, because the endogenous cycle is actually about 24.2 hours without environmental input to reset it. The primary resetting signal is light. Specifically, the presence or absence of light at the retina communicates time of day information to the suprachiasmatic nucleus via a dedicated neural pathway, the retinohypothalamic tract, connecting those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells directly to the clock. When light levels drop at sunset, this pathway signals the suprachiasmatic nucleus to begin coordinating the evening cascade of physiological changes: rising melatonin, falling core body temperature, reduced cortisol, shifting immune activity, slowing heart rate. When light levels rise at sunrise, the cascade reverses. The system is extraordinarily sensitive. Even relatively low-level light exposure equivalent to ordinary indoor illumination, far dimmer than most people would describe as bright, is sufficient to suppress melatonin production. A standard living room or kitchen lit at 100 to 200 lux, which is comfortable for reading, suppresses melatonin by 20 to 30% compared to complete darkness. A screen viewed at close range in a dark room delivers roughly 50 to 200 lux directly to the retina, with a spectral composition heavily weighted toward the blue wavelengths that the intrinsically photosensitive cells are most sensitive to. For most of human prehistory, the only light source available after sunset was fire. Firelight is rich in warm wavelengths, reds, oranges, yellows, and almost completely lacks the short wavelength blue light that drives circadian suppression. Firelight flickers, varying in intensity, rather than providing the steady, constant illumination of electric light. Researchers have found that flickering warm spectrum light has significantly less circadian disruptive effect than steady cool spectrum light at the same average brightness. In evolutionary terms, this makes perfect sense. The visual system needed to evolve sensitivity to a light cue that was present only during true daytime sunlight and not confounded by the firelight that humans spent their evenings in for hundreds of thousands of years. This means that the experience of sitting around a campfire in the evening, which might seem primitive by modern standards, was almost perfectly calibrated to allow the human circadian system to function normally. Warm flickering light at moderate brightness. Melatonin production proceeds on schedule. Sleep onset approaches at the appropriate time, and the body temperature and hormonal rhythms that support healthy sleep begin their evening descent without disruption. The electric light bulb, and more specifically the LED and fluorescent lighting that replaced incandescent bulbs in the name of energy efficiency, is far more disruptive than the incandescent was. LED-based lighting and modern screen displays are heavily weighted toward blue spectrum emission. The irony of the efficiency transition is that cooler spectrum lighting, which is more efficient in terms of lumens per watt, happens to be far more circadian disruptive than the warmer spectrum incandescent that it replaced. From the perspective of the circadian system, the move from incandescent to LED was a step backward, closer to sunlight at the wrong time of day. None of this was understood when these transitions happened. The intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells were not even known to exist until the early 2000s. The full picture of how the retinohypothalamic tract communicates lighting information to the circadian clock and thence to the rest of the body's physiological timing systems has only become reasonably clear in the past 2 decades. We built a world of artificial light without any understanding of how light interacted with the biological systems that depend on its daily variation for their calibration. The analogy to diet is instructive. Humans spent millions of years eating a diet that was unprocessed, varied by season, and varied in texture. Industrial food processing, optimized for palatability and caloric density without any understanding of how processed food would interact with the gut microbiome, insulin signaling, or appetite regulation. The obesity epidemic and the associated metabolic disease epidemic followed from that mismatch. The circadian disruption epidemic, chronic sleep deficit, its metabolic consequences, and the broader range of health outcomes associated with misaligned circadian timing follows from a structurally similar mismatch. We optimize the environment for productivity and convenience without understanding the biology that environment was about to disrupt. The research on circadian misalignment and metabolic health is particularly striking. The timing of food intake, it turns out, matters not just for how much you eat, but how your body processes what you eat. Eating at times that are out of phase with your circadian system, which for most modern people means late in the evening, when the body's metabolic processes are winding down for the night, promotes fat storage, impairs insulin sensitivity, and alters the composition of the gut microbiome in ways that have downstream effects on inflammation and immune function. Night shift workers who eat during the biological night show significantly higher rates of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes than day workers with comparable dietary intake. The difference is almost entirely about timing. This has led to a growing research field called chronobiology, the study of how biological rhythms shape physiology and pathology, and a clinical application called chrononutrition, which examines how the timing of meals can be optimized to align with circadian biology rather than social schedules. The fundamental insight is simple but consequential. The body is not a constant machine that processes inputs identically regardless of when they arrive. It is a time-dependent system in which the same input produces different outputs depending on where you are in the circadian cycle. Go back to the Kalahari campfire and something else becomes clear in light of this research. The pattern of eating in hunter-gatherer societies, consuming food during daylight hours, socializing and telling stories after dark with minimal caloric intake, and then sleeping is essentially the chronobiologically optimal eating pattern. Calories arrive when metabolic processing is most efficient. The evening is low calorie, low light, and socially warm. Sleep follows at a biologically appropriate time. This is not dietary wisdom in any intentional sense. It is simply what the environment produced, but it is remarkably well aligned with what modern chronobiology tells us a well-functioning metabolic system requires. The Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining true hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, have been studied extensively by evolutionary biologist Herman Pontzer and colleagues in recent years. The Hadza are extraordinarily physically active by modern standards. Hadza men walk an average of 11 to 14 kilometers per day during foraging activities, but they consume caloric intakes that are not dramatically higher than those of sedentary urban populations. They are also essentially free of metabolic disease. Obesity is rare. Type 2 diabetes is functionally absent. Cardiovascular disease, while not entirely unknown, appears at much lower rates and at much older ages than in industrialized populations. The Hadza also sleep outdoors, in direct contact with the natural light-dark cycle. Their melatonin profiles, measured by researchers, show timing that is closely coupled to solar sunrise and sunset. They wake naturally as the sun rises and sleep as it sets, with a brief midday rest. Their circadian profiles look the way a circadian biologist would design them from scratch if given the goal of optimizing metabolic health. Whether the health advantages the Hadza show are primarily attributable to physical activity, diet composition, social structure, circadian alignment, absence of processed food, or some combination of all of these is genuinely unclear and actively debated. The confounders in any comparison between a foraging population and an industrialized population are enormous. But the circadian component is increasingly considered a serious candidate explanation, or at least a significant contributor. There is one more dimension of the ancient human night that deserves attention, and it may be the most philosophically significant: what complete darkness does to consciousness itself. Modern people almost never experience genuine darkness. Even in the most light-controlled bedroom, there are standby indicator lights, street light filtering through curtains, the ambient glow from clocks and electronics. True darkness, the darkness of a pre-agricultural campsite on a moonless, overcast night, is an experience that most people have never had and would find profoundly disorienting. Sensory deprivation research has established that the complete absence of visual input changes consciousness in ways that are measurable and consistent. In brief periods of complete darkness, healthy individuals begin to experience alterations in the boundary between self and environment, increases in introspective depth, heightened sensitivity to auditory stimuli, and, in extended periods, spontaneous visual imagery that can range from simple phosphene-like patterns to complex and emotionally significant hallucinations. The visual system, designed to process a constant stream of input, begins generating its own content when deprived of external stimulation. For ancient humans, the period between first and second sleep lying in the darkness with firelight, either extinguished or reduced to embers, eyes open or closed, making little difference, may have been accompanied by exactly this kind of spontaneous visual experience. Combined with the elevated prolactin documented by Ware and the naturally high REM density of the early morning hours, this creates conditions that are, in modern terms, quite close to a guided, meditative, or mildly psychedelic state. This is speculative. The phenomenology of ancient human consciousness during the watch is not directly recoverable, but the universal human practice of relating and interpreting dreams documented across hunter-gatherer cultures and ancient literate civilizations alike suggests that the boundary between sleep and waking experience more permeable and more culturally significant than it is for most modern people. When you wake at 2 in the morning in a well-lit bedroom and immediately check your phone, you are not just suppressing melatonin. You are shutting down the one opportunity during the day when the conscious mind might dwell on the imagery that the sleeping mind has been generating. Freud's theory of dreams was a scientific dead end in most of its specifics, but was not wrong about their cultural and psychological importance. Every known human civilization has had elaborate systems for understanding, interpreting, and acting on dream content. These systems are far more elaborate and practically significant than any modern secular person typically accords them. The common ancestral condition, if the historical and anthropological evidence is taken seriously, was one in which dream recall was high because you woke directly from sleep into a quiet, calm, somewhat dissociative state that favored reflection on what you had just experienced, and in which that recalled content was immediately shared with and processed through a community. The social dimensions of dream sharing are worth considering. Dreams that are shared, interpreted collectively, and responded to by a group function very differently from dreams that are privately forgotten by a solitary waker checking their notifications before getting out of bed. They serve as inputs to collective decision-making, as vehicles for the articulation of social tensions, as repositories of individual experience that become collective property through the act of telling. Many of the functions that therapy now tries to provide a space to articulate and process emotionally charged experience, to find narrative coherence in confusing events, to receive communal recognition of personal difficulty, were provided by the campfire circle on a nightly basis in the context of dream telling and story sharing. The loss of the watch period in this reading is not just a neurochemical loss, it is the loss of a regular practice of psychological integration that was built into the structure of the human day. We did not replace it with anything. We extended the working day and the entertainment day into the time it previously occupied, and we called that progress. What sleep researchers and chronobiologists are now doing is essentially archaeology of the body, excavating the biological systems that were shaped by 300,000 years of nights that no longer exist, trying to understand what those systems were designed to do, and figuring out how much damage the mismatch between ancient design and modern environment is actually causing. The work is painstaking, and the answers are often complicated by confounding variables and the difficulty of doing controlled experiments on systems that operate over decades and lifetimes. But some conclusions are already solid enough to act on. Reducing exposure to blue spectrum light in the hours before sleep through warm spectrum lighting, blue light filters, or simply reduced screen time demonstrably improves melatonin timing and sleep quality in controlled studies. Maintaining consistent sleep and wake times, aligned with sunrise and sunset as closely as practical, reduces circadian disruption. Avoiding caloric intake in the late evening appears to support metabolic health. Spending time outdoors during the morning hours when sunlight is present and the circadian system is calibrated by it improves overall circadian coherence. None of these interventions require replicating the precise conditions of Paleolithic life. They require only a rough approximation of the light-dark and activity-rest patterns that the human circadian system evolved to expect. The ancient ancestors did not know why these patterns were healthy. They did not have the option of disrupting them. But the result of millions of years of living within those patterns is a body that still, beneath the layers of artificial light and processed food and scheduled sleep, expects and functions best within a world that largely no longer exists. The night is not empty. It never was. It was full of fire and story and a second kind of sleep and a sky that the whole community watched together. Understanding what was lost and beginning to understand how much that loss costs, biologically is the first step toward a more honest relationship with a dimension of human existence that most of us have never thought to question. To fully appreciate the scale of what the human night once was, it is worth spending some time on the stars themselves, not in a romantic or spiritual sense, but in a practical and cognitive one. The Milky Way, the luminous band of the galactic disk visible overhead on a clear, dark night, is not a subtle feature of the night sky. In the absence of light pollution, it is overwhelming. Ancient observers described it in terms that modern people, most of whom have never seen it properly, typically underestimate. It appears as a bright, cloud-like river of light crossing the entire sky, bright enough to cast faint shadows on the ground beneath it on nights when the moon is absent. For 300,000 years, every human being on Earth who was awake at night was watching this. Every person who sat at a campfire and looked up between stories saw a sky that contained more visual information about the cosmos than any modern city dweller ever encounters. This matters because of what the brain does with persistent, structured visual information. It finds patterns, it builds models, it generates stories to explain what it sees. The universality of astronomical mythology across human cultures, stories about the shapes in the sky, the movements of planets, the cycles of constellations, is not a coincidence of independently parallel development. It reflects a shared human experience of a sky that was always there, that changed in predictable ways, and that provided raw material for the narrative intelligence that the firelit night was developing. The constellations were not arbitrary. They were the stories that ancient humans told about the most persistent visual feature of their environment. The sky was the original text, and the stars were the original writing. Navigation by stars is well documented in pre-industrial cultures around the world, including the extraordinary celestial navigation practices of Polynesian voyagers who crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean using star positions, ocean swells, cloud patterns, and bird behavior as their only instruments. The cognitive demands of this kind of navigation are enormous. Maintaining a three-dimensional mental model of the sky's movement relative to your position on the Earth, updated continuously as you travel, is an intellectual feat comparable in its abstract demands to the kind of mathematical reasoning that modern educators struggle to teach explicitly. This capacity did not emerge from nothing. It was built from 10,000 nights of watching stars, of learning their names and stories and seasonal positions, of being corrected by elders who had watched longer, of connecting stellar movements to animal behaviors and plant cycles and weather patterns. The star knowledge of traditional cultures was not just navigational, it was integrative, a system that connected astronomy to ecology to social organization to mythology in ways that were mutually reinforcing and collectively managed. The loss of that knowledge and the loss of the dark sky that made it possible happened at almost the same time and for the same reason. Urban light pollution followed from electrification and densification. Traditional ecological knowledge, including astronomical knowledge, was disrupted by colonization, forced cultural assimilation, and the displacement of communities whose knowledge systems had evolved in specific places over long periods. The two losses compounded each other. The people who had been watching the sky for generations lost access to the places where the sky was dark, and the dark sky became inaccessible to the people who remained in those places as urbanization expanded outward. The International Dark Sky Association estimates that roughly 80% of the world's population lives under skies too polluted with artificial light to see the Milky Way. In Europe and North America, the figure is even higher. The portion of the global population that has actually seen the night sky that their ancestors watched every clear night of their lives is now a small minority, concentrated in rural areas far from urban centers, and even those areas are subject to the horizon glow from distant cities. The ecological consequences of light pollution extend far beyond human sleep. Nocturnal animals, a category that includes a substantial fraction of all mammal species, most insect species, and many amphibians and reptiles depend on darkness for navigation, predator avoidance, foraging, and reproduction. Sea turtle hatchlings navigate to the ocean by moving toward the brighter light of the open sea horizon, a reliable cue in a world without artificial light, and a lethal misdirection in a world with illuminated beachfront development. Migratory birds navigate by stars and are systematically disoriented by light pollution, colliding with illuminated buildings in the millions each year in North America alone. Insects drawn to artificial lights are dying in enormous numbers, removing them from food webs that depend on them. The human night was always embedded in a broader nocturnal ecology that humans interacted with, hunting some nocturnal animals, avoiding others, observing the behaviors of animals as environmental signals, living within a world that had its own rhythms after dark. The elimination of that ecology by artificial light is not an isolated human health problem. It is a planetary scale environmental alteration whose full consequences are still being catalogued. Consider too what the ancient human night meant for the social organization of risk. Darkness was dangerous, but within the fire circle, darkness was safe. This spatial binary, the illuminated center versus the dark periphery, created a social structure that was spatially enforced every night. The fire was the gathering point. People who were in conflict during the day would converge on the same fire at night. People who had been apart all day would reunite at the same fire in the evening. The fire was, in a structural sense, the centripetal force of the group. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm at the University of Southern California has argued extensively that the social dynamics of hunter-gatherer groups are fundamentally egalitarian in character, not because people are naturally disposed toward equality, but because coalitional enforcement makes hierarchical dominance too costly to maintain. Larger members of a group cannot simply bully smaller ones when the smaller ones can form coalitions and respond collectively. The campfire, as a nightly gathering point, would have been a physical infrastructure for exactly this kind of coalition formation and enforcement. Everyone could see everyone. Status displays were visible, unfair behavior was observable. The social contract was renegotiated through story and discussion and shared laughter every night. Remove the campfire and scatter people into separate bedrooms illuminated by personal screens, and you lose the physical infrastructure for this kind of social processing. This is not to claim that Netflix causes tyranny, but it is worth noting that the nightly communal gathering has essentially no analog in modern life, and that its absence represents a significant restructuring of the social environment in which human social cognition evolved to operate. The storytelling that Wiesner documented among the Jew Hoansi was not just informational, it was regulatory. Stories about people who overreached their social position, who were greedy, who broke community norms, and the laughter that accompanied them served to maintain the egalitarian social contract that Boehm describes. The campfire was where the values of the group were articulated, tested, and reinforced. It was where children learned what kind of behavior their community prized and what kind it found contemptible. It was where social memory was maintained and transmitted. Every human society has institutions that serve similar functions: religion, law, education, media, but most of these are far more formal, less frequent, and more hierarchical than the nightly campfire gathering. The campfire was democratic in the literal sense. Everyone present had voice, everyone's story had potential value, and the process was self-organizing rather than mediated by designated authorities. The quality of a story, in that setting, was determined entirely by whether it held the attention of the people around the fire. Think about what this means for the development of narrative craft. For hundreds of thousands of years, storytellers operated in conditions of immediate feedback from an audience that was not captive and not polite. If your story was boring, people talked over you or fell asleep or started their own conversations. If your story was good, the fire circle went quiet and attentive. The selection pressure on storytelling skill, exercised nightly over thousands of generations, was intense. The human capacity for narrative, our extraordinary sensitivity to story structure, our emotional responsiveness to characters and arcs and resolutions was honed in exactly this environment. Literary theorists sometimes speak of the campfire as a metaphor for the origin of storytelling. Anthropological evidence suggests it was not a metaphor at all, it was the actual setting. The around the fire narrative was the proto-literature, proto-theatre, proto-religion, proto-law, proto-education, and proto-psychology of the species. Modern literature and film, and theatre and religion and education are all, in some sense, highly elaborated descendants of the stories that ancient humans told each other in the dark to make the night safe and the community coherent. The neuroscience of story comprehension has advanced considerably in the past 2 decades, and it reinforces the special status of narrative as a cognitive tool. When subjects read or listened to a well-constructed narrative, their brain activity shows patterns of neural coupling, with the narrator, a synchronization of brain states across individuals that does not occur with mere information delivery. Uri Hassan at Princeton has documented this phenomenon and describes storytelling as the only known mechanism for direct, reliable brain-to-brain coupling between individuals. A good story does not just transmit information, it temporarily synchronizes the mental states of teller and listener in ways that enhance shared understanding and social coordination. This is precisely what you would want from a nightly communal activity aimed at building group coherence. And it is exactly what the campfire storytelling sessions that Wiesner documented seem to accomplish. The emotional responsiveness of the audience, the laughter, the fear, the admiration is not just a social behavior, it is evidence of neural synchronization. The campfire story was a communal brain state coordination mechanism. The night was when human minds were brought into alignment with one another. What happens when that nightly alignment mechanism is replaced by individual consumption of content on personal screens, filtered by algorithm to maximize individual engagement rather than communal coherence? The question is not rhetorical. Researchers are actively studying the social and psychological effects of the transition from shared media consumption to individualized media consumption. The findings are preliminary, but consistently point in a direction that would not have surprised a hunter-gatherer. Shared experience of the same content, discussed with the same people, builds social bonds and shared frameworks of understanding. Individualized content, consumed alone, does not. This does not mean that smartphones are the enemy. It means that the ancient human need for shared narrative experience, for sitting around the same fire and hearing the same story and laughing at the same joke, has not changed, while the social infrastructure that fulfilled that need has been substantially dismantled and only partially rebuilt in less communal forms. The emergence of shared social media, podcast communities, and streaming series with synchronized viewing experiences as major cultural phenomena may reflect, in part, the hunger for exactly this kind of shared experience. People want to be watching the same thing at the same time and talking about it with people they know. The campfire urge is still there. The campfire is gone. Scientists studying the intersection of anthropology, neuroscience, and sleep medicine are now beginning to ask whether the ancient rhythms of the human night can be recovered in any meaningful sense within modern life, not by literal campfires, though several researchers have suggested that even the practice of limiting evening light to warm-spectrum sources represents a meaningful step, but by creating the conditions that allow the biological systems shaped by those rhythms to function more normally. The answer seems to be, partially and probably worth trying, chronotherapy, the intentional management of light exposure, sleep timing, and feeding patterns to align with circadian biology is an active clinical research area, showing promising results for conditions ranging from depression and bipolar disorder to metabolic syndrome and certain cancers. Time-restricted eating, which limits caloric intake to a window of 8 to 12 hours aligned with daylight, is showing benefits in metabolic disease that appear to be at least partly independent of total caloric intake. Morning bright light therapy, which uses high-intensity full-spectrum light to anchor circadian timing early in the day, is the gold standard treatment for several sleep disorders and shows effectiveness in seasonal affective disorder comparable to antidepressant medication. None of these interventions fully recovers what was lost. The complete darkness of a pre-industrial night, the segmented sleep with its distinct meditative phase, the communal storytelling around a real fire, the unobstructed view of the Milky Way, these are not recoverable at scale in contemporary urban life. The world has changed too completely for that, but the biology has not changed. The circadian system that wakes you at 2 in the morning is the same system that coordinated the wakeful watch of your ancestors. The social hunger that makes you scroll through other people's stories on a glowing screen is the same hunger that gathered humans around fires for 300,000 years. The narrative intelligence that makes you unable to stop watching one more episode is the same intelligence that held the campfire circle spellbound with tales of distant people and impossible events. Recognizing this continuity does not change the practical constraints of modern life, but it does change how you might think about certain persistent frustrations, the insomnia, the social isolation, the hunger for meaningful shared experience, the vague sense that something is missing from a life that is materially comfortable in ways that would have seemed magical to every prior generation of humans. These are not individual failures. They are the predictable outputs of a biological system optimized for a world that has been replaced faster than evolution can respond by a different world entirely. Sleep scientists, chronobiologists, anthropologists, and public health researchers are increasingly converging on a shared conclusion: that the disruption of ancient human circadian and social rhythms by industrial modernity is a significant and underappreciated contributor to a wide range of contemporary health problems. The evidence is growing, the mechanisms are becoming clearer, and the interventions, while incomplete, are demonstrably helpful. What remains uncertain is how much of the loss can be recovered without recovering the conditions that created the ancient patterns in the first place. Whether the biphasic sleep architecture can be stably re-established by reducing artificial light alone, or whether it requires the fuller package of conditions that accompanied it, the communal sleeping environment, the outdoor light exposure, the absence of processed food, the physical exhaustion of a day of foraging, is genuinely unknown. The experiments needed to test this are ethically complicated and practically very difficult. What is known is that the human body, examined carefully, still carries the blueprint of a night that no longer exists. The circadian clock that wants to produce melatonin at sunset rather than midnight, the sleep architecture that wants to divide into two phases separated by a quiet, reflective interval, the social brain that wants to sit with others around a shared light source and listen to stories about the world, the eyes that are sensitive to a sky that 300,000 years of ancestors watched overhead every night and that most contemporary humans have never seen. The research is ongoing, the picture is still incomplete, and the implications for how we design environments, schedule institutions, and think about health are still being worked out. But the direction is clear enough to be worth paying attention to. The night is not just the absence of day, it is a biological environment with its own demands, its own rhythms, and its own physiological requirements. And ignoring those requirements has costs that are only now becoming measurable. Let us consider, for a moment, the question of pain and the night. Modern medicine has understood for decades that pain perception has a strong circadian component, that the same stimulus reliably produces more intense pain perception at night than during the day, and that chronic pain conditions consistently worsen after dark. The mechanisms behind this are multiple and interconnected. Falling cortisol in the evening removes one of the body's natural anti-inflammatory signals. Cooling body temperature increases sensitivity to pain stimuli. The absence of distraction from waking activity allows pain to dominate attention more fully. But there is another dimension. Social isolation amplifies pain. The neuroimaging literature has established that social exclusion and physical pain activate overlapping brain regions, and that the presence of other people, even without active social engagement, reduces pain perception through mechanisms that are not fully understood but probably involve the opioid system. In a world where the night meant sleeping in a group around a fire, the combination of warmth and social proximity may have provided a degree of pain modulation that modern solo sleeping in a cool bedroom does not. This is highly speculative, and there is no way to directly test it on ancient populations. But it is consistent with everything else we know about the social and physiological dimensions of the human night. The campfire was not just warm in a thermal sense, it was warm in a neurological sense. The presence of other bodies, the sound of breathing and movement, an occasional murmured conversation, the shared light source, the collective attention to the same sounds from the darkness, all of these would have engaged social brain systems in ways that had measurable downstream effects on physiology. The practice of what researchers call co-sleeping, sleeping in the same room or bed with another person, is now understood to have measurable health effects that go beyond simple temperature regulation. Adults who co-sleep with a partner show reduced cortisol reactivity to stress, slightly lower resting heart rate and blood pressure, and improved immune markers compared to equivalent adults sleeping alone. The effect is strongest in stable, positive relationships and weaker or absent in conflictual relationships, suggesting it is mediated by the sense of social safety rather than simply by physical proximity. Infants, whose sleep architecture and arousal patterns differ substantially from those of adults, appear to benefit from proximity to a caregiver in ways that include more stable physiological regulation during sleep. James McKenna at the University of Notre Dame has documented that infants sleeping in close proximity to a mother show more frequent arousals, more regular breathing patterns, and lower rates of the prolonged physiological suppressions that have been associated with sudden infant death syndrome. The Western practice of solitary infant sleep in a separate room, viewed by many pediatricians as the safest arrangement, is an extraordinarily recent cultural development with essentially no evolutionary precedent. McKenna and other researchers have argued that the emphasis on solitary infant sleep reflects cultural priorities around maternal independence that have been incorrectly framed as safety guidance. The debate around infant sleep practices is contentious, and this is not the place to resolve it. But the pattern it illustrates is consistent across multiple domains. Modern sleeping arrangements, when examined against the background of evolutionary history, turn out to be highly unusual in ways that have been largely invisible because they are so familiar. We are not sleeping the way our ancestors slept, and the differences are not trivial. The ancient human night was also, in ways that modern people rarely think about, profoundly different acoustically. The absence of ambient mechanical noise traffic, air conditioning, refrigerators, distant industrial processes meant that the natural acoustic environment was the only acoustic environment. This created a relationship between sound and attention that is foreign to most modern experience. In a quiet, pre-industrial night, the sound of a breaking twig at the edge of the firelight was immediately and clearly audible. The behavioral ecology of predator-prey interaction in human prehistory depended heavily on acoustic monitoring of the environment. Human hearing, like human night vision, is not particularly impressive compared to many predators, but it operates very effectively in genuinely quiet environments in ways that it cannot in environments masked by continuous mechanical background noise. Research on the health effects of chronic noise exposure, conducted primarily in the context of urban traffic noise and aviation noise, has found that even noise levels too low to wake people from sleep produce measurable physiological stress responses. Heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol release all show responses to noise during sleep that the sleeping person would not consciously report as disturbance. The World Health Organization has identified environmental noise as the second largest environmental health risk in Western Europe after air pollution. The health costs, calculated in disability-adjusted life years, are substantial. The human body was designed to sleep in a quiet environment where meaningful sounds were rare, distinctive, and required immediate attention. Modern urban sleeping environments provide almost the opposite. Continuous background noise that is meaningless but impossible to ignore at the neural level, punctuated occasionally by sounds that are distinctive and loud but almost never meaningful. The auditory environment of sleep is another dimension in which modern experience departs dramatically from the ancestral condition, with costs that are measurable but underappreciated. Going further back in time, before the reliable control of fire was established and humans were sleeping in trees or huddled in sheltered spots, the acoustic dimension of the night would have been even more important. Primate sleep in trees has been studied in chimpanzees and gorillas, and it shows several characteristics that are clearly adaptive for the environment. Chimpanzees in the wild construct fresh sleeping platforms in trees each night, a behavior called night nesting at heights that are out of reach of most predators. They wake frequently during the night, apparently responding to sounds from the environment. Their sleep is lighter and more fragmented than that of humans, and this lightness appears to serve a defensive function. The transition from tree-sleeping primates to fire-sleeping humans was not just a change in sleeping location, it was a change in the entire architecture of nighttime safety. In a tree, the primary threat detection mechanism was acoustic alertness during sleep. At a fire, the primary threat deterrent was the fire itself, and the primary additional protection was the presence of other people awake or lightly sleeping in the vicinity. Both systems worked, but they placed different demands on the sleeping individual. Tree sleepers needed to maintain sufficient arousal during sleep to respond to threats. Fire sleepers could afford deeper sleep and apparently developed a different system of collective vigilance through unsynchronized sleep timing in the group. The depth and architecture of human sleep is, therefore, in evolutionary terms, relatively recent, dependent on fire as a prerequisite. Before fire, human ancestors almost certainly slept more like other primates, lighter, more fragmented, more acoustically responsive. The deep, consolidated sleep that humans are now trying to achieve and mostly failing at because artificial light and poor sleep hygiene prevent it is itself a fire-dependent adaptation. The full irony is that the artificial light that replaced fire has undermined the sleep architecture that fire enabled in the first place. There is one final dimension of the ancient night that deserves attention: and it concerns the relationship between darkness, fear, and the imagination. The human fear of the dark is one of the most universal and persistent fears documented across cultures and developmental stages. Small children reliably develop fear of the dark in the period between 18 months and 3 years of age, regardless of whether they have had frightening experiences in the dark. This developmental universality suggests a prepared fear, a bias in the fear system that emerges on a genetic developmental schedule rather than requiring direct learning. The evolutionary function of darkness fear is obvious. In a world with large nocturnal predators and no artificial light, a strong motivational bias towards staying in the light, or at least staying near fire, would have been strongly adaptive. Children who wandered away from the camp at night would have been disproportionately killed by predators. The fear of the dark was a life-saving heuristic. But fear of the dark is not just fear of predators. Archaeological and historical evidence makes clear that humans have consistently populated the darkness with supernatural entities, spirits, demons, ghosts, monsters whose properties are designed to explain unexpected sounds, sudden deaths, sleep paralysis, night terrors, and the general sense of being watched that the human threat detection system generates in low-light environments. The darkness was not just physically dangerous, it was the domain of the unknown, the unpredictable, and the imagined. Anthropologists studying the cultural functions of supernatural belief have noted that belief in beings that can monitor behavior from concealment, that punish wrongdoing, and that operate outside the normal limits of human social consequence, gods, spirits, ancestors, serves a social regulatory function. It extends the reach of social norms beyond the direct surveillance of community members. In a world where much of the night was genuinely impenetrable darkness, the intuition that something was watching from that darkness would have been socially useful in exactly this way. This may be one reason why the most powerful and culturally significant supernatural entities in most religious traditions have deep connections to the night, to darkness, to the underworld, and to the transitions between day and night. The night was where the imagination had free reign. It was where the visible world ended and the world of inference and imagination began. Religion, in many of its forms, has always been, at least partly, about making that dark border safe through story and ritual and shared belief. The scientific study of the ancient human night has revealed that the darkness was far richer and more structured than modern people typically imagine. It contained the infrastructure of culture, the foundations of health, the mechanisms of social cohesion, the raw material of myth, and a distinct mode of consciousness that most contemporary humans have never accessed. Understanding that richness is not an exercise in nostalgia, it is an attempt to understand what we are, where we came from, and what the costs of the world we have built actually are. The research community working at the intersection of these questions is expanding. Anthropologists, sleep scientists, chronobiologists, ecologists, architects, and public health researchers are beginning to coordinate across disciplinary lines in ways that were not possible even 20 years ago. The International Dark Sky Association is working to establish designated dark sky reserves and parks where natural night conditions can be preserved. Urban planners are beginning to experiment with adaptive street lighting that reduces light levels in the middle of the night when pedestrian activity is minimal. Sleep researchers are developing more sophisticated, chronotype-aware approaches to scheduling schools and workplaces in recognition that forcing everyone to operate on the same clock, regardless of individual circadian variation, imposes avoidable health costs. Whether these efforts amount to a meaningful recovery of what was lost is uncertain. The scale of the disruption is enormous, and the economic and social inertia behind the current arrangement is enormous. But the direction of travel toward a more honest reckoning with the biology that artificial light has disrupted seems clearly correct. For each individual person reading this or listening to it, the practical implications are real and actionable. Reducing blue spectrum light in the hour or two before sleep, maintaining consistent sleep and wake times, spending time in natural daylight during the morning hours, and treating the occasional wakeful interval in the middle of the night as an opportunity for quiet reflection rather than a disorder to be medicated, these are all low-cost, evidence-supported steps toward a more biologically aligned relationship with the night. They will not recover the Milky Way. They will not rebuild the campfire circle. They will not restore the watch period to its full neurochemical richness or the storytelling to its communal function, but they represent a step toward acknowledging something that is easy to forget in a world where the night has been so thoroughly colonized by artificial light that the darkness was not just an absence, it was a presence, one that shaped us for hundreds of thousands of years in ways we are only beginning to understand. The immune system offers another lens through which to examine the costs of circadian disruption, and the findings are among the most consequential in the field. The relationship between sleep and immunity is not simply that you need rest to fight infection. It is more specific and more profound than that. The timing of immune function is deeply circadian, with different branches of the immune response calibrated to operate at different times of day. Innate immunity, the fast, non-specific first responder system that responds to pathogens immediately, shows peak activity during the sleeping period. Adaptive immunity, the slower, antigen-specific system that produces targeted antibodies and trained immune memory, shows peak activity during waking hours. This division of labor makes functional sense. During sleep, when energy consumption is reduced and the body is in a restorative state, the metabolically expensive work of immune memory consolidation and antibody production can proceed most efficiently. During waking hours, when the body is active and potentially encountering new pathogens, the immediate response system is at its most alert. Disrupting the sleep-wake cycle scrambles this scheduling. Shift workers who chronically misalign their sleep and immune rhythms show markedly higher rates of infection and significantly worse responses to vaccination than day workers. A study published in the Journal of Experimental Medicine found that the timing of vaccination relative to the circadian clock affected antibody production by a factor of 4. The same vaccine produced 4 times the antibody response when given in the morning versus the evening in subjects with well-regulated circadian rhythms. The cancer connection is particularly alarming. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified night shift work as a probable human carcinogen, the same classification given to ultraviolet radiation, mustard gas, and lead. The biological mechanism is not fully established, but it likely involves both the immune disruption described above and the direct effects of melatonin. Melatonin, the hormone that artificial light suppresses, is not only a sleep signal, it is also an antioxidant and appears to have direct anti-proliferative effects on several cancer cell lines. Population studies consistently find elevated cancer rates in populations with chronically disrupted circadian rhythms, including not just shift workers but blind individuals who cannot detect light and therefore cannot entrain their circadian clocks normally, and populations in extreme northern and southern latitudes where seasonal light cycles are exaggerated. Ancient humans, who experienced reliable darkness from sunset to sunrise every night and whose melatonin production followed a tight daily rhythm calibrated to actual sunset, had immune systems running on the schedule they were designed to operate on. Whether this translated into meaningfully lower cancer rates is impossible to know. Cancer is a disease of aging, and ancient humans mostly did not live long enough to accumulate the mutations that produce the most common adult cancers. But the principle is clear. The circadian immune schedule is an adaptation, and disrupting it is costly. The brain's glymphatic system, one of the most important recent discoveries in neuroscience, provides yet another window into why the ancient sleep architecture may have been more functionally important than a simple efficiency calculation would suggest. The glymphatic system, identified by Mike and Nedegard and colleagues at the University of Rochester in 2012, is the brain's waste clearance system. During deep sleep, glial cells in the brain shrink by roughly 60%, dramatically increasing the space between cells. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through this expanded interstitial space, flushing out metabolic waste products including beta-amyloid and tau protein, the pathological aggregates associated with Alzheimer's disease. The glymphatic system is almost entirely inactive during waking. Its work is done during sleep, primarily during the deepest stages of non-REM sleep. This means that the quality and timing of sleep is directly tied to the brain's ability to clear potentially toxic waste. Chronic sleep disruption, whether from artificial light, delaying sleep onset, from noise causing frequent arousals, from a schedule that doesn't allow adequate time for deep sleep, or from the segmentation of sleep into multiple interrupted periods throughout the night rather than allowing natural architecture, impairs glymphatic function. Epidemiological data shows that chronic short sleep duration is one of the strongest modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease identified to date. A 20-year prospective study published in Nature Communications in 2021 found that sleeping 6 hours or fewer per night in midlife was associated with a 30% increased risk of developing dementia later in life, independent of socioeconomic, behavioral, cardiovascular, and mental health factors. Whether this is fully causal through the glymphatic mechanism or partly reflects the fact that early dementia causes sleep disruption rather than vice versa is still being established, but the biological plausibility of the mechanism is high. Ancient humans, sleeping in the biphasic pattern with adequate total sleep time distributed across the night, would have had robust opportunity for glymphatic function. The interruption between first and second sleep, far from being a waste of time, may have served its own physiological purpose. Research on the timing of deep sleep within the night cycle shows that the deepest slow-wave sleep typically occurs in the first half of the night, while REM sleep is concentrated in the second half. If the segmented sleep pattern reliably produced deep slow-wave sleep in the first phase and REM-rich sleep in the second phase, it may have been particularly efficient at capturing the physiological benefits of each stage. This is speculative in the absence of direct data on ancient human sleep staging, which is clearly impossible to obtain. But it is consistent with what Ware's experiment showed. The biphasic pattern, when it naturally emerged, was not random fragmentation. It was a structured architecture, with the wakeful interval occurring at a specific physiological moment between the slow-wave-rich first phase and the REM-rich second phase. Move forward from prehistoric nights to the agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and you encounter a dramatic change in how humans organize their relationship with the night. Agriculture required fixed habitation. You needed to stay near your fields and your livestock. Fixed habitation made possible more elaborate shelters and eventually buildings. Buildings changed the acoustic and thermal environment of the night. The development of pottery, textile production, and eventually metalworking created crafts that could be practiced in the evening by firelight, extending the productive hours that fire had always made available. The first evidence of candles dates to roughly 3,000 years ago. Candles were expensive in terms of the animal fat or beeswax they consumed, which meant they were used selectively rather than universally. But they represented the first step in the unbundling of fire from the night, the first technology that provided light without warmth, without the communal focal point of the campfire, without the connection to the specific ecological and social context of the outdoor fire circle. The move from campfire to hearth fire to candle to oil lamp to gas lamp to electric light is a long technological trajectory, each step making artificial light cheaper, cleaner, more controllable, and more socially isolating. The campfire was necessarily shared. A candle could be private, an electric lamp could be in a separate room, a screen could be in a pocket, carried everywhere, viewed alone. Each step in this sequence corresponded to changes in how the night was organized socially. The development of reading as a common leisure practice in early modern Europe, enabled by cheaper candles and eventually by printing making books accessible, created a form of private nighttime activity that pulled individuals out of the communal oral culture that had structured the evening for most of human history. The novel, the long, solitary, silent reading experience emerged in exactly the period when candlelight was becoming affordable enough for middle-class households. The private inner world that the novel cultivated was in some sense made possible by the private light that candle and lamp provided. This is not a lament. Literature is among the most extraordinary achievements of human culture, and the private inner life it cultivates has value that does not reduce to campfire storytelling. But it represents a genuine transformation from a night culture organized around shared oral narrative to one organized around individual written narrative that happened gradually enough to be invisible as it occurred. The transition to electric light then accelerated this individualization dramatically. Electric light made nighttime nearly identical to daytime in its social possibilities, which meant that every activity that had previously been confined to daylight hours became available after dark. Work could continue, shopping could continue. Entertainment, in the form of cinema, then television, then streaming, offered an alternative to communal oral culture that was simultaneously more polished and more passive. The audience that once sat around the fire and participated in the telling of stories became an audience that sat in front of a screen and consumed stories produced by professionals and delivered by corporations. What was gained in production value was genuinely extraordinary. The films, novels, and television series produced by industrial entertainment culture represent a flowering of narrative craft that would have been inconceivable to any prior human community. But what was lost? The participatory, responsive, communally generative quality of the campfire story has not been replaced by anything with equivalent social function. Interactive storytelling, video games, tabletop role-playing games, improvisational theatre, communal fan fiction represents partial attempts to recover the participatory dimension. Social media represents a more widespread but more fragmented attempt at communal narrative sharing. None of these fully replicate the conditions of the campfire: the physical co-presence, the shared sensory environment, the mutual vulnerability of sitting together in the dark, the direct feedback loop between teller and audience. Virtual reality researchers have proposed that immersive shared virtual environments might eventually come close to replicating the social experience of physical co-presence, and the evidence from telepresence research suggests that the gap between physical and virtual presence is narrowing as the technology improves. Whether a virtual campfire can do what a real campfire does, physiologically and socially, is an open empirical question that will become increasingly important as these technologies mature. For now, the ancient human night remains largely inaccessible to most modern people, not as a lived experience, but as a biological and cultural heritage that continues to shape behavior and health in ways that are mostly unexamined and often misinterpreted. The insomnia that afflicts a large fraction of the industrialized world's population is the most obvious symptom of this disconnection. But the epidemic of loneliness, the fragmentation of shared cultural experience, the growing difficulty of sustaining attention in conditions that require it, and the widespread sense that modern life, despite its material abundance, is somehow missing something. All of these may have roots that reach back to a night that has been lost. The scientific program of recovering that night, of understanding it well enough to partially reconstruct its biological benefits in modern conditions, is still in its early stages. The questions that remain open are numerous, and the answers will require sustained collaborative research across disciplines that have historically not communicated with each other well. Sleep medicine, chronobiology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, public health, and environmental science will all need to contribute if the full picture is to emerge. What is already clear from the convergence of evidence reviewed here is that the human night was not an undifferentiated period of unconsciousness to be gotten through as efficiently as possible. It was a biologically structured, socially organized, culturally generative, psychologically distinctive portion of the human day, as important to health and human flourishing as anything that happened during daylight hours, and far more deeply shaped by evolutionary pressures than the 2 centuries since its elimination would suggest. The stars are still there, above the light pollution. The circadian biology is still there, beneath the artificial light. The impulse to gather around a shared light and tell each other stories to synchronize our minds through shared narrative, to make the darkness safe through shared attention, is still there, expressing itself in whatever forms the current environment allows. Understanding where these impulses come from and what they originally served does not just answer historical questions. It clarifies what human beings actually need from a night, and what modern life is systematically failing to provide. There is a poignant detail in the historical literature on segmented sleep that is easy to overlook, but worth sitting with. Among the references that Roger Kirch collected from pre-industrial Europe, several describe the middle of the night waking period not with frustration or alarm, but with something closer to gratitude. Medieval and early modern writers described the watch as a gift, an unexpected interval of peace in the middle of life's demands, a time that belonged entirely to private thought and prayer, and the slow processing of whatever the day had brought. One document from the early 1600s describes a man lying awake between first and second sleep, thinking about a disagreement he had had with a neighbor, working through the arguments on both sides, arriving at a perspective that felt clearer and more charitable than anything he had managed during the day. He does not describe this as insomnia, he describes it as the most valuable hour of his day. Modern people who experience exactly this, waking in the early morning hours with a clarity of thought that the busy day does not allow, typically describe it as a problem to be solved. They worry about not getting enough sleep. They calculate the hours remaining until they need to be awake. They reach for screens, they take medication, they lie there fighting the wakefulness, which makes it worse. The possibility that this wakefulness is not a problem but a feature, that the body is offering a specific neurochemical state that was once used for reflection, dream interpretation, quiet creativity, and intimate conversation, is almost entirely absent from modern discourse about sleep. The medical model of sleep treats any departure from consolidated 8-hour sleep as a pathology. The historical and anthropological model suggests that the departure is the system working as it was designed to work, and the 8-hour consolidation is the historical aberration. This is not to say that insomnia does not exist or does not cause genuine suffering. Pathological insomnia, the inability to sleep when the body requires it, driven by anxiety, hyperarousal, or other clinical factors, is real and treatable. But the category of insomnia has expanded in popular understanding to include experiences that may not be pathological at all. Waking in the middle of the night and being unable to return to sleep immediately, lying awake for an hour before sleep onset, sleeping in shorter intervals with brief awakenings. These experiences, depending on context, may be normal variation in human sleep architecture rather than signs of disorder. The practical implication is worth stating directly. If you wake at 3 in the morning and lie there for an hour, unable to sleep, the worst thing you can do, according to both sleep medicine and evolutionary logic, is to turn on a bright light or look at a screen. The best thing you can do is to stay in the dark, let your mind wander, and allow the prolactin-mediated state that your body is trying to enter to do whatever it was designed to do. This is not guaranteed to solve every sleep problem, but it is more consistent with the biology than the alternatives. The broader message from 300,000 years of human nights is not that we should return to caves and campfires. It is that the biology we carry was built in a world where night was dark, where sleep was communal, where the evening was marked by warm fire and shared story rather than blue spectrum screens, and where waking in the middle of the night was not an emergency, but an expected and even welcome interval of quiet. Designing modern life with that biology in mind, rather than against it, is one of the more important and underappreciated challenges facing contemporary medicine and public policy. The night shaped us. It continues to shape us, whether or not we acknowledge it. The only question is whether we understand it well enough to work with it rather than against it. The research says we are getting closer to that understanding. The distance we have yet to travel is still considerable. The conversation about light, sleep, and human health is moving quickly now. Research published in the last 5 years has substantially refined our understanding of how specific wavelengths of light affect specific neural circuits, how individual chronotype variation interacts with environmental light exposure, and how the accumulation of circadian disruption over a lifetime compounds risk in ways that shorter-term studies could not detect. The picture that is emerging is simultaneously more alarming than the original estimates and more tractable than the scale of the problem might suggest. It is more alarming because the effects of chronic circadian misalignment appear to be cumulative in ways that are not fully reversed by occasional episodes of good sleep. The concept of sleep debt, the idea that lost sleep can be fully recovered by sleeping longer on weekends, has been substantially undermined by laboratory research showing that performance deficits from chronic sleep restriction do not fully recover, even after extended recovery sleep. The metabolism of the sleep-restricted brain is persistently altered in ways that reflect long-term adaptation to insufficient sleep rather than simple restoration to baseline. This has implications for how we think about the decades of mild sleep disruption that most modern people accumulate. It is more tractable because the intervention research is increasingly specific. Rather than generic advice to sleep more and use screens less, chronobiologists are now able to offer calibrated recommendations based on individual chronotype, seasonal variation, latitude, and the specific pattern of light exposure. Wearable devices capable of monitoring light exposure, activity, and sleep architecture in real-world conditions have enabled the kind of large-scale naturalistic data collection that laboratory experiments cannot provide. The result is a much more nuanced picture of how modern light environments interact with individual biology and a more precise toolkit for addressing the mismatch. Where this research will lead over the next decade is genuinely unclear, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the field scientifically interesting. The fundamental questions how much of the ancient biphasic sleep architecture can be recovered in modern conditions, whether the glymphatic benefits of the ancient sleep pattern can be approximated by optimized consolidation, how much social and cultural scaffolding around sleep matters for its restorative function, whether artificial light can be designed to be as circadian neutral as firelight while still serving modern needs, remain open. The tools to answer them exist or are being developed. The will to fund the research is growing as the economic costs of poor sleep become impossible to ignore. In the meantime, the ancient night persists as a reference point, not as a utopia to be returned to, but as a biological baseline against which the costs of our current arrangements can be measured. 300,000 years of human nights shaped by fire and darkness and communal story left us with a body and a brain that still, beneath everything modernity has built, expect and require a relationship with darkness that most of us are not providing. That relationship is worth recovering as much as the conditions of modern life allow, not for romantic reasons, for biological ones.